Okay, so in this lesson we're going to get started by adding some particles to our aircraft. Okay, so we have our aircraft here. We have the modeling finished, we have the rigging and animation completed. So now we're ready to start adding some final touches to this sequence. And we're going to start that by going in and adding some particles to sort of this back end of this aircraft. So that way, at this point where the hose starts to separate, we can start to get some steam and other things, sort of like the fuel line is just leaking a little bit while this aircraft is taking off, and then it will come to a stop right about the time it starts to pull away. Okay, so let's come in and just start by adding in our particles. We're going to do this by going into our Create tab. We're going to go into our Geometry. If we pull this menu down, in the same place where we have Standard Primitives, Extended Primitives, Compounds, if you look down here, we have Particle Systems. So we're going to click on that. Now within 3ds Max, we have a few different particle types to choose from. So things like spray, snow, super spray, all these down here are very closely related to each other, and you'll find a lot of the same parameters throughout all of these. The only difference is this PF. This is a particle flow type particle. Now this is a completely different type of particle. It's definitely a little bit more specialized, quite a bit more complex to work with. So in this course, we're going to stay away from the particle flow. We're going to stick with some of these simpler, easier to control particle systems. Now, as far as which one you want to start with, that's really up to you. In my case, I'm going to start with the super spray, and we'll build on top of that. So we're going to click on this super spray. Now, once we click on this, we have to create the emitter itself. So what I'm going to do is press the T key on my keyboard to switch to my top view. We'll get in here, and I'll switch to a wireframe just so I can see a little bit easier where to put this. Doesn't really matter if we're exactly precise, because we can always come back and move this later. So I'll just come in here and click and drag. This is essentially where my emitter is going to be. So I'll try to make my emitter roughly about the same width as this hose. Go ahead and let off, and when I'm done, just right click to get out of my creation mode, and here's my emitter. Okay, very nice. I'm going to switch to my perspective by just hitting the P key on my keyboard. And here is my emitter. So if I come in here and start to scrub through this, you can see what we have. Now, if you look closely, you can see this little arrow, which is part of my emitter. Right now, that little arrow is pointing up. I actually don't want that. I want the arrow to be pointing down, because that is going to be the direction of my particles. So let's come in here and let's take that emitter and swing that around about 180 degrees. There we go. Okay, very nice. Now, one of the nice things about using this particle system that we have here, this super spray, is the fact that we really don't have to scrub through our timeline to see the result of our particles. With a lot of 3D applications, we have to come in and manually simulate every time we want to see a change to our particles. With 3ds Max, we don't have to worry about that. As soon as we make a change, it's instantly reflected in our scene, and that's going to be very, very useful. So if you see these little dots, these little crosses, those are the actual particles themselves. So as I start to scrub through, you can see they're actually pointing and emitting downward, which is a direction of my emitter. Alright, so far so good. Now let's take our emitter here, let's go over into our Modify panel, and let's start to make some adjustments to this super spray. So as we start to get in here, there are actually a lot of parameters that are tucked away in a lot of these different rollouts. So we're going to spend the next couple of lessons working on refining these particles, but even spending a couple of lessons talking about this, we're not going to be able to get into every single little nuance of this particle system. But we will show you how to really come in here and start to get a lot of the major adjustments that you'll want to. So the first thing we need to do is just start to work on the particle behavior itself. Right now, if you look at this, it really doesn't look like smoke. It just sort of looks like this little stream of particles. Okay, so let's first work on the behavior and sort of the spread. Now, with our super spray emitter selected, the first thing I like to do is roll down here, and underneath this basic parameters rollout, down toward the bottom, we have percentage of particles. This is tucked underneath the viewport display. So right now what this means is that the viewport is only showing us 10% of the particles that are being generated. Well, when it comes to working with particles, you'll probably want to see what this actually looks like. So to get a more accurate feedback, I'm going to crank this all the way up so that we can see 100% of the particles in our scene. Now all of a sudden this starts to look much more full. Okay, that's usually one of the first things I like to do. Now we still have this issue where we have just this odd little straight stream of particles. Okay, so let's come in and start to sort of work with this. What I'm going to do is just isolate this emitter. I'm going to press Alt-Q on my keyboard so we can isolate this. That way we can see this with a little bit more clarity. Okay, so the first thing we have is the off-axis and the off-plane. So these two, if we come in here and start to spin this, this will sort of rock this back and forth, and the off-plane will sort of rotate that around. This might be a little bit easier to see if I press the T key on my keyboard to switch to a top view. So with the off-axis, let's go in and zero these back out. Again, with the off-axis, you can see it's sort of swinging back and forth if we're looking at it from the top down, and the off-plane is sort of rotating that around. Okay, so you do have some control over the actual angle and the direction that your particles are going to be emitted. We also have this spread. Now this is actually fairly useful, so we're going to make sure that we are at a point in our timeline where the particles are being emitted. So again, looking from the top down, if we start to introduce this spread, it's going to sort of spread that out. If I press the P key on my keyboard, we can see this a little bit easier. So the spread, you can see as we go from about a 90-degree angle, you can see right here. So what that's doing is spreading it out from sort of this central area, and we're going 90 degrees outward in both directions. So we're essentially getting a 180-degree spread of particles now. Okay, now below this we have our other spread for the off plane. Now this one, as we start to adjust this, it's a little bit difficult to see what is actually happening here. So again, I'm going to switch to the top view, just press the T key on my keyboard. So you can see right now with this spread set to 0, even though it is spread out in 90 degrees, it's still just a straight line if we were to view this, again, just from the top down. So what this spread down here will do is start to spread it out sort of in a spherical pattern. Okay, so now if we look at it from the top view, we have much more sort of outward spray of particles, a little bit more natural, so it's going to spray out in all directions. And again, if I press the P key on my keyboard to switch back to my perspective view, we can see just what we have here. Okay, so definitely take some time to play around with these. It might take a little bit of time to actually get familiar with these, but once you do, you'll find these to be really, really useful. So what I'm going to do is take my spread and keep that at about 180 degrees down here, and I'll take my off-axis spread and I'll keep this a little bit lower, so that way we're not sort of spraying particles out in all directions. It's maybe a little bit more focused spray of particles, so maybe about 26, 28. Okay, now to get out of this isolation mode, I'm just going to press Alt-Q once again. Okay, very nice. I think I can definitely make do with that. Now one of the things that we have here is that these particles are actually sort of emitting at the wrong point. So they're going to start emitting right from the beginning of my timeline, and you can see before the plane actually lifts off, the emission stops. Okay, so let's go ahead once again, grab that super spray. We're going to go into the modify panel. Let's scroll down. Let's open up this particle generation rollout. And right now we have this emit start and emit stop. This is controlling when the particles are going to start their emission and at what frame they're going to stop. So right now they're going to start emitting at frame 0 and stop emitting at frame 30. You can see that's exactly what we have here. On my timeline, if you take a look, once we pass frame 30, my emission stops. Now we want to change this. We want the emission to start right about here, about frame 65, when this hose starts to pop off. So let's take the emit start, set that to start at frame 65. Okay, so our plane starts to take off, and we'll maybe have the emit stop at about frame 100. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at what this looks like through the render camera. So I'm going to press the C key on my keyboard. We'll switch this to the shot cam. Let's scrub through here. There we go. So right about the time that hose pops off, our aircraft lifts up and our particle emission starts. Now right now we have obviously the problem where the particles are staying put. They're not actually moving with the aircraft as it starts to take off. So we'll start to address this in our next lesson, and also spend some time finishing out the rest of our particle behavior.